She was told to move, to shrink, to disappear from the very street she had bled and sweated to walk. In front of an entire town, one man decided that Ida Mae Strom's body, her size, her strength, her very existence, was an offense to polite society. He was wrong. Because the moment he opened his mouth, he set into motion a chain of events that would reshape the entire Oregon Territory. This is the story of a woman who refused to be erased, a brooding man who saw her worth when no one else did, and a love forged in dust, danger, and fire. If this story moves you, hit like and drop the name of your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels. Now, stay with me. Every single word matters. The morning of the market day began the way all great catastrophes do, slowly, and with the smell of something ordinary. Wood smoke threaded through the cool September air of Crestfall, Oregon, curling from the chimneys of the general store, the blacksmith's shop, the two-story hotel that leaned slightly to the left as though exhausted by its own ambitions. The main street, a wide corridor of hard-packed earth and wagon ruts, was alive with the kind of noise that only a true market day could produce. Merchants bellowed prices. Children shrieked and darted between the legs of horses. Somewhere behind the feed stalls, a fiddle player was doing his best and failing magnificently. The whole town smelled of sawdust, leather, boiling corn, and the particular animal warmth of too many bodies pressed together in too little space. It was, by all appearances, a perfectly fine morning. Ida Mae Strom had been awake since 4, she always was. The body that the town of Crestfall had spent the better part of a decade mocking had been up before the sun, hauling water from the creek behind her rented room at the edge of town, scrubbing the week's worth of laundry she had taken on from 3 different households, wringing the heavy canvas trousers and flannel shirts with hands that had grown so strong from the work that the knuckles barely bent anymore. She had eaten a heel of bread standing over the washboard. Not sitting, there was no time for sitting, and by the time the church bell struck 7, she had already done more physical labor than most men in Crestfall would manage before noon. She was 31 years old. She had been doing this since she was 16. Ida Mae was a large woman, tall, broad-shouldered, built with the kind of density that comes not from indulgence but from endurance. Her arms were roped with muscle beneath the soft weight of her skin. Her hands were calloused and cracked, permanently stained at the knuckles from the lye soap she used for heavy washing. She moved through the world with a deliberate, unhurried gait, not because she was slow but because she had learned long ago that rushing drew attention. And attention in Crestfall was rarely the kind you wanted. She kept her hair pinned back under a faded cotton bonnet. She wore the same gray dress she wore every market day, the one with the let-out seams and the patched elbow, because it was clean and it was hers and that was enough. She had come to the market for soap lye and a new scrub brush. Simple errands. She had her coin purse tucked into her apron pocket, and her shopping list memorized, and she intended to be back at her washboard before 10. She did not intend to become the center of anything. The trouble began at the corner of Market and 2nd, where a construction crew had been laying fresh timber framing for what would eventually become the new bank building. The foreman of that crew was a man named Doyle Pratt, thick-necked, red-faced, possessed of the particular cruelty that flourishes in men who have just enough authority to wield it and just enough cowardice to enjoy it only when they have an audience. He had an audience today. Market day guaranteed it. Ida Mae was making her way along the boardwalk when Doyle Pratt stepped deliberately into her path. He was not a tall man, but he planted himself wide, thumbs hooked in his suspenders, and he looked at her with the practiced contempt of someone who had rehearsed this kind of moment many times before. "Hold on there," he said. Ida Mae stopped. She recognized the tone before she recognized the man. She had heard that tone her entire life. "You planning to walk right through here?" he said, loud enough for the people nearest them to hear, loud enough for heads to turn. "Down the main street?" With all these decent women about, the fiddle player somewhere behind them scraped to a stop. A woman with a market basket paused and turned. A man leaning against the post of the hardware store straightened slightly, the way men do when they sense entertainment coming at someone else's expense. Ida Mae said nothing. She had learned that too, that silence was sometimes armor, that giving no reaction was the only way to deny a man like Doyle Pratt what he truly wanted, but Pratt was not finished. He was just warming up. "I'm talking to you," he said, stepping closer. "I asked you a question. You think it's appropriate, walking around here like this? In front of people? You're an offense to every decent woman on this street. A woman built like a draft horse, tramping around in public like she's got as much right to this road as anybody else." He turned, gesturing to the growing cluster of onlookers, pulling them in, making them complicit. "Somebody needs to tell her to find another way around. There's a back alley. Take it." Someone laughed. It was a short, ugly sound, quickly joined by another. Ida May felt it the way she always felt it, not in her face, not in her eyes, but somewhere deep beneath the sternum, a kind of slow implosion, like a building settling into itself after a fire. She had felt this exact sensation so many times that she could almost name its particular texture. It was not quite shame. It was something older than shame. It was the feeling of being told, again and again, in every way that language and bodies and laughter could manage, that you were taking up more space than you had been allotted by a world that had never intended to make room for you in the first place. She turned slightly, intending to step around him. Not in defeat, she told herself that, even then, but because the soap lye and the scrub brush still needed to be purchased and she had work waiting and she could not afford the luxury of standing here and feeling this for one moment longer than necessary. "That's right," Pratt said, and there was a satisfaction in his voice that was almost obscene. "Move along. Do the rest of us a favor." More laughter. Louder now, and that was the moment the street went silent, not the gradual quiet that falls when something boring happens, the sudden, complete, total silence that drops like a curtain when something shifts in the atmosphere and every animal instinct in every person present says, "Pay attention. Something is about to happen." Ida May did not see him at first. She heard him, footsteps on the boardwalk. Measured, unhurried, heavy with intention. The sound of a man who has never once in his adult life been in a hurry because the world has always waited for him to arrive. And then she saw the shadow before she saw the man, a long, dark shape falling across the dusty street as Hawk Mercer stepped out from the doorway of Halverson's Hardware and positioned himself in the space between her and Doyle Pratt with the absolute, geological stillness of someone who has just made a decision and is entirely at peace with every consequence of it. Hawk Mercer was 40 years old, though he looked younger in certain lights and considerably older in others. He was built long and lean, with the particular kind of hardness that comes not from the gym but from decades of actual physical reckoning with the world, from hauling ore samples, from walking the miles of his logging operations. From the silent, sustained tension of being a man who had built everything he owned from a starting position of nothing and had learned to hold it with both hands. His face was angular and dark with several days of unshaved stubble. His eyes were the color of Winter Creek water, gray-green and very cold. He wore a dark coat over a plain shirt, and he carried no hat, and he looked at Doyle Pratt the way a man looks at a smear of something unpleasant on the bottom of a good boot. "Pratt," he said, "just the name. Nothing else." But the way he said it, flat, quiet, carrying with it some weight that Ida May could not immediately identify, made Doyle Pratt's chest deflate by approximately a full inch. "Mr. Mercer." Pratt's voice had lost its performance quality. "I didn't, I know what you were doing." Hawk's gaze moved from Pratt to the crowd, slow and deliberate, landing on each face long enough to make the person wearing it uncomfortable before moving to the next. "I heard every word." He paused. "Every one of you who laughed. I saw your faces." The silence deepened. Someone in the back of the crowd began quietly edging away. Hawk looked back at Pratt. "You have contracts with the Mercer operation," he said. "Timber framing on the Delacroix Road. The sluice work above Coldwater Creek. For separate jobs, if I'm counting correctly." "Yes, sir," Pratt said. He was sweating now, visibly, despite the cool morning air. "Consider them reviewed," Hawk said. He turned his head slightly, just enough to address the man Ida May recognized as Bradley Wills, Pratt's silent business partner, who was standing 3 feet back and had gone the color of old ash. "And yours, Wills. I believe your crew holds the gravel contract through winter. Present your paperwork to my office by Friday. I'll want a full accounting." Wills made a sound like a man who has just stepped on something sharp. "You don't have to bankrupt me over," Pratt started, "over a woman standing on a public street." Hawk finished. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Over a woman who was walking. Bothering no one, on a road she has every right to walk. That's the part you want me to explain?" "Because I will. I'll explain it in detail, in front of whoever wants to listen, and we'll see how many more jobs in this county you manage to secure after that conversation." Pratt shut his mouth. Hawk turned away from him as though he had already ceased to exist, which, Ida May suspected, was the cruelest cut of all, and he looked at her directly for the first time. Up close, his eyes were more complex than she'd expected. There was something behind the cold gray-green, something that she couldn't name in the fraction of a second she had to observe it, but it wasn't pity. She had received enough pity in her life to recognize its particular flavor. "And this was not it, Miss Strom," he said. She blinked. He knew her name. She did not know how. "I have a position available," he said. "At my camp. Head laundress for the full operation, mining side and logging side both. The work is hard, the location is remote, and the pay is substantially better than whatever you're currently receiving in this town." He paused. "I suspect the company will also be an improvement." Ida May looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, the crowd was very still. She was aware of every eye on her, aware of the absurdity and the strangeness of the moment, aware that she was standing in the middle of the main street of Crestfall with soap on her hands and a cracked scrub brush in her basket, being offered a new life by a man most people in the territory spoke of in hushed and slightly frightened tones. She thought of her rented room. She thought of her washboard. She thought of the sound Doyle Pratt's laughter had made and the way 3 separate people had joined it without hesitation or shame. "What are the terms?" she said. Something shifted in Hawk Mercer's expression. Not quite a smile, the muscles around his eyes, perhaps. A fractional loosening of whatever it was he kept clenched behind his jaw at all times. "Fair ones," he said. "We can discuss details on the road. My wagon is at the north end of town. I was leaving this morning regardless." He turned and began walking, and it was only when he paused and looked back that Ida May realized he was waiting for her, not gesturing for her to follow him. Waiting for her to decide. Waiting for her to walk beside him, or not, entirely on her own terms. Behind her, she heard Doyle Pratt say, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Well, I'll be damned." Ida May picked up her basket. She adjusted the bonnet on her head. She took one long breath of the September air, which smelled of wood smoke and corn and fiddle rosin and the particular dust of a market day crowd, and she thought, "I have scrubbed blood from strangers' clothing since I was 16 years old in this town, and not one person on this street has ever once said my name the way he just said it." She walked. The crowd parted for her this time. She did not look at any of them. She held her head level and she moved with her usual deliberate unhurried pace, and she was aware of the sound of her own footsteps on the boardwalk and the sound of Hawk Mercer's footsteps beside her, and nothing else at all, until they had passed the last storefront and the crowd noise fell away behind them like a wave receding from a shore. At the edge of town, where the northern road began and the pines started to cluster on either side of the track, Hawk's wagon was waiting. A heavy-framed work vehicle pulled by 2 sturdy draft horses, loaded in the back with crates and canvas-wrapped equipment. A young man of about 20 sat on the driver's bench looking profoundly unsurprised to see his employer arrive with a woman and her market basket. "This is Dale," Hawk said. "He doesn't talk much. You'll like him." Dale touched the brim of his hat at Ida May without comment, confirming this assessment entirely. Hawk helped her up into the wagon without ceremony and without condescension, simply offered his hand as he would have offered it to anyone who needed to climb 3 feet off the ground, and did not make the fact of the assistance into a performance or a statement. He climbed up after her on the other side, and Dale clicked his tongue at the horses, and they began to move. For a long while no one said anything. The town of Crestfall fell away behind them, and the pines thickened on either side of the track, and the dappled September light came through the canopy in shifting patches of gold and shadow. And Ida May sat with her basket on her lap and her hands folded over the handle of her broken scrub brush and thought about the fact that she had just agreed to travel to a logging camp in the middle of an Oregon forest with a man whose name she associated primarily with the phrase, ruthless as sin, and the secondary phrase, rich enough to be whatever he wants. "How do you know my name?" she said, eventually. Hawk was looking at the road ahead. "I've been aware of the quality of your work for about 8 months, he said. "I tried to hire you through a third party in the spring. The offer was declined on your behalf before it reached you." Ida May stared at the side of his face. Declined by whom? Mrs. Calloway. Ida May thought of her most reliable employer, the woman who had controlled her access to the better households in Crestfall, who had acted as a kind of agent for the better-paying washing jobs, who had taken 15% of every arrangement she brokered and who had, Ida May now understood, been taking rather more than that. "She told me no one in the valley was interested in your operation," Ida May said carefully. "That would be consistent with what she told my man," Hawk said. "She didn't want to lose you." A long silence settled between them. The horses moved at their steady pace. A hawk, not the man, an actual bird, lifted from a nearby branch and swept low across the road ahead of them before rising back into the pines. "Where exactly is this camp?" Ida May said. "End of the forest trail," Hawk said. "There's only one road in and one road out. The canopy's so thick you won't see direct sunlight much between the trees. Some men find it difficult. Most adjust. I'm not most men," Ida May said. He looked at her then, a full, unhurried look, nothing hidden in it and nothing performed. "No," he said. "I know that." They drove for 3 more hours without anything resembling small talk, and Ida May found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have spent so much of their lives in the company of people who talked at them rather than with them that the absence of noise feels not like emptiness but like relief. By the time the trail narrowed and the canopy closed overhead, genuinely closed, the great interlocked arms of the Douglas firs reaching across the sky and blocking it out so completely that the light went green and dim and the temperature dropped by what felt like 10 degrees, Ida May had formulated 47 separate questions about her new position and decided to ask none of them yet. She would see it first. She had always believed in seeing things for herself before deciding what she thought about them. The camp announced itself first by sound, the distant rhythmic bite of axes, the grinding shriek of a sawmill, the low rumble of men's voices, and then by smell, pine resin and wood smoke and the particular pungent tang of men who worked hard outdoors in all weather. Then by light. The camp clearing itself was larger than she'd expected, a wide circular break in the forest where the trees had been felled and the stumps leveled, with log-built structures arranged around its edges, a bunkhouse, a cook shack, a supply barn, and several smaller outbuildings. Dozens of men were visible across the clearing, all of them stopping and looking up as the wagon rolled in. It was the particular kind of collective attention that Ida May have been conditioned her entire life to receive with dread, the mass swiveling of heads, the measuring pause, the assessment. But these men, she noticed, were not looking at her the way the crowd in Crestfall had looked at her. They were not looking at her body. They were looking at the wagon, at Hawk Mercer stepping down from it, at the fact of a new arrival at a camp that didn't often have them. It was a different kind of looking, cautious, curious, not yet formed into opinion. Hawk dropped to the ground and turned to offer her his hand again. Ida May took it, climbed down, and stood in the dirt of the camp clearing with her market basket and her broken scrub brush, looking around at the dense green walls of the forest pressing in from all sides, at the green dim light filtering down through the canopy, at the 30-odd rough-hewn faces watching her from across the clearing. This is Ida May Strom. Hawk said, addressing them all without raising his voice, in the tone of a man who has never needed to raise his voice to be heard. She's our new head laundress. Anyone who gives her trouble gives it to me. Anyone who needs something from her asks first, asks politely, and pays the agreed rate. Those are the terms. He picked up 2 of the crates from the wagon bed and carried them toward the supply barn without another word, leaving her standing there. One of the men, a large, grizzled figure with a red beard and a diagonal scar across his left cheek that had clearly been acquired at significant personal cost, separated himself from the group and walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her with a gaze that was evaluating but not unkind. "Callum," he said. "Camp foreman. You'll need hot water and a proper setup. I'll show you where the spring is." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You haven't seen the laundry." He was right to warn her. The laundry was catastrophic. Weeks of accumulated heavy canvas trousers, flannel shirts, wool undershirts, all of them stiff with a combination of tree sap, or dust, blood from minor injuries, and the kind of embedded grime that only comes from men who work 16-hour days in the deep forest with no one to answer to about personal hygiene. There were crates of it. Literal crates. Ida May stood in the doorway of the small outbuilding that served as the wash house and looked at the accumulated disaster of 30 men's working wardrobes and felt something happen in her chest that she had not expected. Not dread. Not despair, relief. This was work she understood. This was the language she was fluent in. Filth and fiber and water and effort and the slow, satisfying transformation of something wrecked back into something usable. She had been doing this her entire life, and she was better at it than anyone who had ever tried to make her feel small for it. She set her basket down on the work table. She took off her bonnet and hung it on the peg by the door. She rolled her sleeves up to the elbow, revealing the full, formidable architecture of arms that had been built by exactly this kind of labor. She picked up the worst of the canvas trousers, a pair so stiff with dried sap it could have stood upright on its own, and she dropped it into the first bucket of water from the cold spring and she began. Outside, through the thin walls of the wash house, she could hear the sounds of the camp resuming its business. The axes. The sawmill. The low rumble of voices. Hawk Mercer's voice among them somewhere, not raised, never raised, giving some instruction that made the person receiving it respond with immediate, clipped agreement. Ida May worked. The water from the spring was cold enough to make her hands ache within minutes, but she had worked with cold water so long that her hands barely registered it as pain anymore. It was simply information, the temperature of the task, the particular quality of this morning's labor. The sap came loose slowly at first and then faster as she established the rhythm of it. And the blood, old, brown, thoroughly set into the fibers, required the lye soap and patience and the particular grinding circular motion she had developed over years of working with this exact kind of stain. She worked until noon. Then past noon. She worked until the light through the small window of the wash house told her the afternoon was deepening toward evening, and then she worked some more. At some point she became aware that someone had left a tin cup of hot coffee on the edge of the work table nearest to her. She did not see who had brought it. By the time she noticed it, it had gone slightly cool. She drank it anyway, standing over the washboard, and it was the best coffee she had tasted in years, strong and dark and honest. With no pretension to it whatsoever, she thought, this is a place where things are what they are. She thought, I have not been in a place like this before. She thought, I could stay here. She didn't let herself think much beyond that, not yet, because the canvas trousers still needed wringing and the flannel shirts were still soaking in the second bucket and there was easily another 2 days of work in those crates, and the light was going, and she had the practical business of surviving. The first day in a new place to manage before she allowed herself the luxury of hoping about anything, but the thought sat there, quiet and solid at the back of her mind, through the rest of the evening's work, I could stay here. Outside the wash house, through the dimming green light of the forest clearing, Hawk Mercer stood with his camp foreman and went over the week's timber yield numbers, and if his gaze drifted more than once toward the thin yellow rectangle of the wash house window and the moving shadow visible through it, Callum was too experienced a man to comment on it. He did allow himself one observation, made to the trees rather than to his employer. "She didn't stop once," he said. "Not the whole day." Hawk said nothing, but his jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was thinking something he had not decided yet whether to say. The camp settled into its evening routines around them. The cook shack lit up. The smell of beans and salt pork drifted across the clearing. Men drifted in from the tree line with axes over their shoulders and the particular satisfied exhaustion of people who have done an honest day's work in the physical world. One by one the small windows of the bunkhouse began to glow. In the wash house, Ida Maystrom finished wringing the last canvas pair, hung it on the drying line she had strung across the back wall, and wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at what she had accomplished in a single afternoon, a third of the accumulated backlog, clean and hanging, the water in the buckets gone a deep amber from the extracted grime, the work table organized, the lye-soaked portion for tomorrow morning. The scrub brushes arranged by size. She cracked her knuckles. She rotated one shoulder and then the other, feeling the deep warm ache of muscles properly used. Then she picked up her bonnet, hung it back on her head, picked up her basket, still containing the list for soap, lye and a new scrub brush, neither of which she had managed to purchase, and she walked out into the camp clearing under the dim green canopy of the forest, into the evening air that smelled of pine and wood smoke and something cooking that was probably better than she'd eaten in months, and she thought, yes. This will do. She ate alone that first evening, which was not unusual and which she did not particularly mind. Callum had shown her the small cabin at the far edge of the clearing that would serve as her quarters, a single room with a rope bed, a cast iron stove, a small table, and a window that looked directly into the dense wall of Douglas firs. It was the size of a generous closet. It was also entirely her own, which made it, by Ida May's accounting, the finest private space she had ever occupied. Her rented room in Crestfall had shared a wall so thin she could hear her neighbor breathing, and before that had been a series of arrangements so marginal they barely qualified as shelter. She set her basket on the table. She sat on the edge of the rope bed and tested its give. She looked at the cast iron stove and estimated correctly that it would heat the small space to near suffocating warmth within 20 minutes of lighting, which in the deep cold of the forest nights would be a blessing rather than a complaint. Someone had left a plate of food on the table, beans, salt pork, a thick wedge of cornbread, covered with a cloth to keep it warm. She did not know who. She ate every bite standing at the window, watching the camp settle into darkness outside the glass, watching the last lights in the bunkhouse windows wink out one by one. She had not asked Hawk Mercer a single question about her terms. She had not yet been told her wage. These were facts about her situation that would have kept any reasonable person awake with anxiety. And she was aware of that, and she was aware that she was not anxious, and she was not entirely sure what that meant about her. She thought it probably meant she was more tired than she realized. She fell asleep with her boots still on. By the end of the first week, she had cleared the entire accumulated backlog of the camp's laundry. Every canvas trouser, every flannel shirt, every wool undershirt, every heavy work sock, washed, wrung, dried, and returned to its owner with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided that the quality of her work would be the only introduction she needed. She did not ask for praise. She did not position herself for it. She simply produced. Every single morning, a volume and quality of clean workwear that the men of the camp had never experienced in the entire history of the operation. On the fourth day, Callum appeared in the doorway of the wash house while she was midway through a particularly grim batch of ore-dust-caked trousers from the mining side of the operation. "Men are asking questions," he said. Ida May did not look up from the washboard. "What kind of questions?" "About how you're doing all of it," he said. "Mick and two others tried to help you yesterday afternoon. You'd already finished before they got here. The spring water is cold," she said. "Cold water sets the sap loose faster than I expected. I adjusted my method on day 2. She paused, working the canvas against the board. "Also the men who tried to help were using the wrong soap. That's why they were slow before." Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want me to pass that along? I want you to tell them which soap to use if they ever need to do their own emergency washing," she said. "The lye soap in the red tin. Not the tan bar. The tan bar is for skin, not canvas. Someone's been using it on the trousers for months, which is why the fabric's going thin at the knees." There was a longer pause this time. When she glanced up, Callum's scarred face had arranged itself into an expression she hadn't seen on it before, a kind of respectful recalibration. As though he had built a particular mental structure about who she was and was now, quietly, tearing it down to build a better one. "I'll pass it along," he said. He started to leave, then stopped. "Wage arrangement," he said. "Mercer says to tell you it's $40 a month, plus full room and board, plus coal for the stove through winter. He also says the terms are negotiable if the arrangement doesn't suit you." Ida May's hands paused on the washboard. $40 a month. In Crestfall, working 5 separate households and taking on everything Mrs. Calloway would broker her, she had been making $18 a month and considering herself fortunate. "The terms suit me," she said, and returned to the canvas trousers. She did not see Hawk directly for most of that first week. He was present in the camp. She heard his voice in conversations with Callum, with the mining supervisor, with the wagon drivers who came in every few days with supplies, but he did not come to the wash house, and she did not seek him out. She was aware of this mutual non-approach in the way you become aware of negative space, the shape of the gap between two things that are orbiting each other without yet finding the angle of intersection. He came to the wash house on the 8th day. She heard his footsteps and knew them before he appeared in the doorway, the same measured, unhurried wait she had noticed on the boardwalk in Crestfall, the sound of a man moving through the world on his own schedule. She kept working. "Callum tells me you identified a soap problem that's been degrading the work trousers for at least 2 seasons, he said. "The tan bar," she said. "Someone bought bulk and didn't read the label or didn't know the difference. Canvas wants lye. Lye wants cold water, at least to start. The men were using warm water, which helps with some stains but sets sap permanently. You've lost probably 12 pairs of trousers to it. The knees are compromised. You'll see them start to tear within the month." A pause. "You can tell all of that from washing them. You can tell a lot about how people are living from washing their clothes," she said. "It's like reading, except the text is dirt and we're patterns." She heard him move, not toward her but to the side, settling against the doorframe in a way that suggested he intended to stay for a while. She did not object. "What do the men's clothes tell you?" he said. She considered this while her hands continued their work. "That they're working harder on the logging side than the mining side right now," she said. "The loggers' clothes have fresh sap stains, which means active cutting. The miners' clothes have mostly dust and less blood than last month, which means either the new tunnel is safer or you've pulled men off the dangerous section. The cook's apron tells me he's been making stew 4 days out of 7 because those are the only stains that come from that angle." She paused. "And Callum got caught in rain on Tuesday and didn't change for at least 6 hours afterward, which isn't good for him because I suspect his left shoulder is worse than he lets on and the cold damp will have settled into it." Hawk was very quiet for a moment. "His shoulder," he said carefully. "How do you know about his shoulder?" "The way he hangs his left arm when he thinks no one's watching," she said. "And the way the left sleeve of his shirt is more twisted than the right at the end of each day. He favors it when he's tired. He doesn't favor it when he's being observed. Because he doesn't want anyone to know." Another silence. "I've worked with Callum for 9 years, Hawk said. "I didn't know about the shoulder. You weren't watching his shirt," Ida May said. He laughed. It was a short sound, abrupt, as though it surprised him as much as it surprised her, and it transformed his face in the fraction of a second before he contained it, turning something that was normally closed and careful into something briefly, genuinely open. Ida May felt the sound of it do something odd in her chest, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. She kept her eyes on the washboard. "The wage is acceptable," he said, when the moment had passed. "More than acceptable," she said, "if you need anything for the wash house." Equipment, supplies, a new scrub brush, she said. Mine is cracked. I was in Crestfall to buy one when the morning took a detour. I'll have Dale bring 3 from town, he said. Any particular specification? Stiff bristle. Not the soft kind they sell for kitchen use. Done, he said. He straightened from the doorframe. She heard him about to leave, and then he stopped. Miss Strom, he said. Ida May, she said automatically. She had never felt like a miss anything. The formality sat on her like a coat that didn't fit. A small pause. Ida May, he said, and her name and his voice had the same quality it had had on the Crestfall boardwalk, something careful in it. Something that was not quite tenderness but was moving in that direction, the way a river moves before it decides to turn. I'm glad the morning took the detour it did. She did not answer right away. She was aware that she was constructing the answer with more care than she usually gave to the construction of sentences. So am I, she said. He left. The sound of his footsteps moved away across the clearing, and Ida May stood at the washboard in the green dim light of the forest morning and breathed for a moment, just breathed, her hands still in the cold water, feeling the particular sharp clarity that cold always produced in her, that sense of being very present in her body. Very awake, very much here, she returned to the trousers. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was the most sustainable Ida May had known in her adult life. The work was hard, always hard, genuinely and relentlessly hard, but it was hard in a way that made sense to her, that followed its own logic from effort to result without the arbitrary cruelties she had navigated in Crestfall. The men of the camp adjusted to her presence with the pragmatic speed of people who have learned not to waste energy on attitudes that don't serve the work. Within 2 weeks, 3 different men had gone out of their way to haul extra water to the wash house without being asked. Within 3 weeks. A miner named Orrin, quiet, large, with hands the size of dinner plates, had built her a second drying rack from scrap timber because she had mentioned, once and only to herself, that the single rack wasn't quite enough for the full operation. She had not mentioned it to Orrin. She had not mentioned it to anyone. He had simply noticed. She began to understand that this was the texture of the camp, that people here communicated in observation and action rather than in the elaborate social performances she had navigated in town. The men showed respect not through compliments or words but through showing up with water, through taking their laundry claims in order without argument. Through the way they addressed her, not Miss Strom, not Hey Woman, but Ida May, said plainly and directly, the way you say the name of a person whose presence you have simply accepted as a fact of the world. She found she loved the forest itself in a way she hadn't expected. The green dark of it, the way sound moved differently under the thick canopy, the cold that came up from the earth in the mornings and the way the mist sometimes sat in the clearing until nearly noon. She loved the creek, loved the cold shock of its water, loved the particular smell of pine resin and wet earth that the whole place exhaled continuously. She had spent her life in a town that felt like a series of walls. And here was something that was the opposite of walls, something that went on in every direction, dense and alive and entirely indifferent to human opinion. It was in the forest that she first spoke to Hawk without the washboard between them. She had taken to walking the perimeter trail in the early evenings, after the last of the day's work was hung and drying and before the camp settled into its supper routine. It was the only 30 minutes of the day that belonged to no one and nothing, and she guarded them fiercely. One evening in the 4th week, moving along the trail where the firs pressed closest and the light went entirely to shadow, she heard footsteps coming toward her from the opposite direction, and recognized them before the figure came into view around the curve. They stopped on the trail, facing each other, with about 6 feet of forest path between them. Hawk looked at her with that same unhurried attention. He was carrying nothing, which she had come to understand was unusual. He was almost always moving with purpose, with something in his hands. Tonight he appeared to simply be walking. You found the evening trail, he said. 3 weeks ago, she said. I come this way most evenings, he said. I haven't seen you. You come around sunset, she said. I come earlier. He considered this. You've been timing it to miss me, he said. It was not an accusation. It was simply an observation, delivered with the same quality as all his observations, flat, accurate, without judgment. Ida May thought about lying and decided she did not have the energy for it. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She looked at him for a moment. The forest was very quiet around them, the particular deep quiet of the hour before dark, when the daytime birds have stopped and the nighttime creatures have not yet begun. "Because I needed the time to be alone," she said. "And because I suspected that if I walked into you out here with no one else around, the conversation might be more complicated than I was ready for." Hawk was quiet for a long moment. "That's honest," he said. "It seemed like the right approach with you," she said. "You don't seem like a man who does well with dishonesty." "I don't," he said. "I've never learned the patience for it." He paused. "Are you ready for a complicated conversation now?" The forest breathed around them. Somewhere high in the canopy, something moved, a bird, or the wind, or both. "Ask what you're going to ask," she said. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had been carefully not thinking about for 4 weeks with mixed success. "I want to know about you," he said. "Not the practical parts, those I've learned from Callum and from watching. I want to know who you are before all of this." Before Crestfall, it was not what she had expected. She had been braced for something about the work, or about her plans, or possibly about the soap situation, which had apparently become a minor legend in the camp. She had not been braced for this. "That's a long conversation," she said. "I walk this trail most evenings," he said, so she told him. Not all of it, not that night, but the outline of it, the childhood in a small eastern Oregon town with a mother who took in laundry and a father who had left early enough that she barely had a memory of his face, the years of learning the work alongside her mother, the move to Crestfall at 16 after her mother's death. The long grinding accumulation of work and isolation and the particular loneliness of being someone that a town had decided to put in a specific box and seal shut. Hawk listened the way he did everything, completely and without interruption, with no performance of sympathy, with no reflexive interjection. He simply received what she said and held it. When she finished, the trail had gone dark enough that she couldn't quite make out his expression, only the shape of him against the deeper dark of the trees. "I left home at 18, he said, after a while. It was offered without context or preamble, the way you offer something in return, weight for weight. I had $40 and a pack mule and a geological survey map that turned out to be partially wrong. I spent 2 years moving around the territory looking for mineral deposits before I found the first vein above Coldwater Creek. By then I'd been so alone for so long that when I finally hired the first crew, I didn't know how to talk to them. I still don't, particularly." A pause. "Callum does the talking. I do the deciding. That seems like it works," she said. "It works," he said. "It's a lonely way to live," she thought about that. "Most ways of living are lonely," she said, "if you don't have the right person in them." He didn't respond immediately. The silence had a different quality to it now, something charged in it, something that was pressing gently at the edges of the conversation like water testing a dam. "Ida May," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. He stopped. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "I need you to understand that I am standing here in an Oregon forest at almost full dark having worked 11 hours today and I am not ready to hear it said. I will probably be ready at some point. Not tonight." Another pause. And then, to her relief and to something that was not quite relief, something warmer and more complicated, he said, "All right," and nothing else. They walked back toward the camp in a silence that was nothing like the one that had preceded it. This silence had shape and texture and a kind of forward momentum, like a river that has found its direction and is moving now with quiet confidence toward wherever it is going. That night, Ida May lay on her rope bed in her small cabin and looked at the ceiling and thought about the way he had said "all right," without frustration, without wounded pride, without any of the manipulative softening that she had observed in men who were told no and treated it as an opening for negotiation. He had simply heard her, and adjusted, and continued. As though her pace was the right pace and he had no interest in any other, she thought, "Be careful, Then she thought, I have been careful my entire life and I am 31 years old, and the sum of all that caution is a cracked scrub brush and a rented room in a town that wished I didn't exist. She rolled onto her side and watched the shadows move on the cabin wall from the last embers of the stove. And she thought about the weight of his attention when it rested on her, not the assessing, cataloging weight she had known from other eyes, the kind that measured and found her wanting or found her excessive or found her something to be managed. His attention had a different quality. It was the attention of a man looking at something he finds genuinely remarkable and is still in the process of understanding what to do about that. She had never been looked at that way. She had not known, before Hawk Mercer, that it was something that could exist. Over the weeks that followed, they built something that neither of them named aloud, a series of converging habits, small and regular. That together constituted a kind of architecture. He began arriving on the evening trail at a slightly earlier hour. She stopped timing her walks to avoid him. They moved in the same direction along the perimeter, and they talked, or they didn't talk, and both were equally sustainable. He told her about the mine, about the geology of it, the particular quality of the ore, the challenges of the tunnel system, the way the water table complicated everything underground. He talked about it the way someone talks about a thing they love that has cost them enormously, with a complicated pride that contained both the achievement and the toll of it. She listened and asked questions that were better than the ones his engineers asked him. Because she had no stake in the answers except genuine curiosity, and he found himself explaining things he had never articulated to anyone before because she simply waited for the explanation without filling the space with assumptions. She talked about fabric. About the way different fibers responded to cold versus heat versus chemical action. About the satisfaction of taking something ruined and returning it to function. She was aware, telling these things, that they were not glamorous topics, that in a parlor in a proper house she would have been expected to find something more decorative to discuss. But this was not a parlor, and Hawk Mercer was not a parlor man, and he listened to her talk about lye soap and sap resin with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, complete. Steady, real. One evening in the 6th week, they were standing at the point on the trail where the creek crossed under a natural bridge of moss-covered roots, and the water was running fast with the recent rains, and the sound of it filled the space under the canopy with something that felt almost musical, and Hawk said, without preamble, "You could have been anything." Ida May looked at the water. "I am something," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean that you are wasted in what Crestfall had you doing. Your mind alone." He stopped himself, started again, choosing his words with visible care. "The way you see things. The way you read situations and materials and people. You should have been running something." "I am running something," she said. "I'm running your laundry operation, Ida May." "I know what you mean," she said. She was quiet for a moment, watching the water move over the roots. "But I'm not sure the world I was born into and the world where a woman like me gets to run things are the same world." "They could be," he said. "They could be made to be." She looked at him then. He was looking at the water, not at her, which made it easier to study his face, the angular lines of it, the stubble, the slight tension around his jaw that was, she had learned, his version of barely contained feeling. He was not a man who wore his interior life on his exterior in any conventional way. But she had been reading difficult texts her whole life, and she had learned his. "What are you saying, Hawk?" she said, very quietly. He looked at her. The creek ran beneath them. The forest was enormous and dark and close on every side, and the two of them stood on the moss-covered root bridge like two figures balanced at the center of something that was tipping, very slowly, toward its inevitable resolution. "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that I think you see me more clearly than anyone I've known. And I think I see you more clearly than anyone has seen you. And I think those two facts, together, are the most important thing in my life at this particular moment." Ida May looked at him for a long time. "That's not a complicated conversation," she said, finally. "That's a very simple one." Something happened in his face, the slow release of something long held, a quiet tectonic shift that rearranged the landscape of his expression from closed to open, from guarded to present. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is, she did not touch him. He did not touch her. They stood on the root bridge over the running creek in the 6th-week evening of the Oregon forest and looked at each other with the full, unhurried attention of two people who have each spent a very long time in the world without being truly seen by it, and who have just, in the same moment, been seen. Then the creek ran. The forest breathed its cold resin breath. Somewhere above the canopy, invisible, the sun set on the Oregon Territory and the night came down like a long, slow exhale, and Ida Mae Strong turned toward the camp lights in the clearing and Hawk Mercer walked beside her, and the distance between them on the trail was slightly less than it had been going out. It was not the end of caution. Neither of them was a person who abandoned caution quickly. But it was the end of the pretense that they were simply an employer and his laundress occupying adjacent spaces in an isolated camp by coincidence of professional arrangement. It was the beginning of something that neither of them, in all their respective years of managing difficult terrain, had any existing map for, which meant, Ida Mae thought, as the camp lights grew brighter ahead of them through the trees, that they would have to build the map as they went. She had always been better at building things than she had been at following other people's directions. She thought she could manage that. The map they were building together turned out to be more complicated than either of them had anticipated, not because of what existed between them, which grew with the quiet, irresistible momentum of water finding its level, but because of what existed outside the forest. The outside world, as Ida Mae had learned many times over the course of her 31 years, had a persistent habit of inserting itself into spaces where it was not invited. It began with a rider. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 8th week, coming down the single trail into the camp on a horse that had been pushed hard enough to be breathing in the heavy, labored way of an animal asked for more than was comfortable. The rider was young, barely 20, and he wore the kind of clothes that were trying to suggest importance without quite having the raw material to pull it off. He asked for Hawk Mercer by name, and when Callum told him Hawk was at the mine head, 2 miles east along the creek, the young man produced a sealed envelope from his coat and held it as though it were a live coal he was trying not to drop. Ida Mae was at the wash house door, wringing out a flannel shirt, when she watched Callum take the envelope with 2 fingers and look at the seal the way he looked at most things, slowly, without giving away what he was seeing. Then he looked at the rider. "You'll wait," he said. It was not a question. The rider waited. He sat on a stump at the edge of the clearing and did not meet anyone's eyes and declined the coffee that Orrin offered him with the automatic nervousness of a person who is performing a task for someone they fear. Hawk was back within the hour. Ida Mae heard him before she saw him, the particular rhythm of his stride, which she had by now memorized so completely that she could identify it through walls and across the clearing and distinguish it from every other set of footsteps in the camp. He came in from the east trail with his mining supervisor, speaking in low tones, and then Callum intercepted him and held out the envelope and Hawk's conversation with the supervisor stopped mid-sentence. He looked at the seal. Something in his posture changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious to most observers. But Ida Mae had been reading Hawk Mercer for 8 weeks and she caught it. The slight tightening across the shoulders, the fraction of additional stillness, the quality of attention that shifted from routine to alert. He opened the envelope. He read the single page inside with his back to most of the camp. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his coat pocket, and said something to Callum that sent the foreman immediately toward the bunkhouse at a pace slightly faster than his usual. Hawk did not come to the wash house that day. He did not appear on the evening trail. At supper in the cook's shack, he sat at the far end of the long table with Callum and the mining supervisor and the 2 senior loggers, and their conversation was too low to hear from where Ida Mae sat with Orrin and 2 of the younger miners, but the quality of it, the particular tightness of it, the way all 5 men kept their voices down and their eyes off the rest of the room, told her everything she needed to know about its general character. Something was wrong. Something was coming. She did not ask. That night, alone in her small cabin with the stove burning and the forest pressing close and dark against the window glass, she turned over what she knew and what she suspected and constructed, from those components, a reasonable picture of the situation. The territory had been consolidating for 2 years. She had heard this even in Crestfall, which was not a sophisticated town but had its share of people who followed money and power the way dogs follow scent. The smaller operations were being swallowed or squeezed out. There were names that circulated in connection with this process, spoken quietly, with the careful effect of people who understood that some names attracted attention from the wrong directions. The name that circulated most frequently, in the most careful voices, was Clement Reed. Clement Reed was the county assessor. He had held the position for 11 years, and he wore it the way some men wear religion, as a costume for what was actually something else entirely. He controlled the tax records, the land assessments, the documentation that determined who officially owned what in 3 counties. He also controlled, through arrangements that were understood by most of the territory's serious businessmen but provable by none of them, a loose confederation of men who specialized in the application of persuasion through methods that left no official record. The persuasion worked as follows: Reed's associates would arrive at an operation. They would explain, in cordial and reasonable terms, that the county's interest in the welfare of local business was significant, and that this interest could be expressed in the form of ongoing protection from the various difficulties that tended to befall operations in remote and isolated areas: equipment failures, supply route disruptions, labor problems, the kinds of accidents that happened when men worked in dangerous terrain without adequate safeguard. The fee for this protection was a percentage of the operation's quarterly profit. The percentage began modest and grew. Those who paid, continued. Those who refused, experienced the difficulties the protection had been designed to prevent. In escalating in creative variations, until they either paid or failed, Hawk Mercer had not paid. He had not paid because he was constitutionally incapable of paying, not from financial inability, which was never in question, but from a fundamental refusal that went deeper than business calculation. Ida May understood this about him without having been told it directly. There were certain arrangements Hawk would not make regardless of cost, and arrangements that required him to acknowledge that someone else held power over what he had built were at the top of that list. She learned the specifics 2 days later, when he finally came to the wash house. He appeared in the doorway on Thursday morning without the envelope or the mining supervisor or any of the external apparatus of crisis. And he looked at her for a moment with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, not quite uncertain, because she was not sure he was capable of uncertainty in the conventional sense, but something adjacent to it, something that was the Hawk Mercer version of standing at the edge of a thing he hadn't fully mapped yet. "How much of this do you already know?" he said. "Clement Reed sent you a letter," she said. It wasn't his first. This one had a number in it, and the number was a deadline rather than an offer. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes. "Callum told you." "No one told me anything," she said. "You had the look of a man reading his last warning. Not his first negotiation. And Reed's been working up to this territory for 2 years." He came into the wash house and leaned against the wall the way he had learned to do over 8 weeks, a posture he had developed specifically in this space, a slightly more informal version of how he held himself everywhere else, as though the wash house was a place where some of his scaffolding came down. "He's given me 30 days to agree to terms. The percentage he's asking for is 30 points of quarterly net. At current output, that's approximately $4,000 per quarter, which you could afford," she said. "Which I won't pay," he said. "Not to him. Not to anyone I know," she said. She paused, working the last of a set of ore-stained trousers through the final rinse. "What's the alternative he's left you?" "He hasn't left one. Men who decline at this stage don't usually remain in operation long enough to make a counteroffer." He was quiet for a moment. 3 operations in the Northern Valley declined last year. 2 burned in the fall. One had a cave-in that the official investigation called an accident and that every man who's ever worked underground knows wasn't. Ida May hung the trousers on the line. She dried her hands on her apron. She turned and looked at him fully, which she had learned to do without the washboard as an intermediary only in the last 2 weeks, a small thing. Perhaps, but it felt significant, the act of facing him with nothing between them and no task to anchor the moment in. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I'm sending for a lawyer from Portland," he said. And I'm writing to the Federal Land Office about Reed's assessments, because 3 of them in the past year don't hold up to scrutiny, and I've had someone looking at the records." He paused. "It's a slow process." 30 days is not a slow process. "Do you have allies?" she said. "Other operators," he squeezed, 2 who would speak if it came to a formal proceeding, he said. "Not before. They have families, children." Changed the calculation, she said. "Yes," he said. He looked at her directly. "I'm telling you this because you have a right to know the situation you're in. The camp is isolated. If Reed's men move against the operation, the trail is the only way in or out, and that becomes a problem rather than an asset." She understood what he was telling her. She also understood, in the same moment, what he was not saying, that he could arrange for her to leave, to go somewhere else, somewhere safer, and that he was not arranging this because he could not bring himself to say it, because the prospect of her leaving was not something he could present as a practical option without it costing him something he wasn't willing to pay. "I'm not leaving," she said. His jaw moved in that way it did. "Ida May, I'm not leaving," she said again, without heat, without drama, with the simple finality of someone stating a fact about the natural world. "I have a contract with you. And I have 40 years of experience watching what happens to women who run from the thing that's chasing them. It follows. The only thing that stops it following is turning around." She paused. "Besides, I know where everything in this camp is. If there's trouble, that's useful." He looked at her for a long moment. The forest light came through the small wash house window and caught the side of his face, and she could see in it, in this particular light, the faint lines of the years he had spent out in the Oregon weather, the particular weathering of a man who has been alone outdoors for a long time. She thought, "I have been looking at this face for 8 weeks and I am still not finished with it. You could at least argue with me," she said. "You'd win," he said simply. She turned back to the wash line and straightened one of the hanging trousers by its hem, which did not need straightening but gave her hand something to do. "Tell me about Reed's men," she said. "How many, what kind?" And he told her. He told her with the detail of someone who had been gathering intelligence carefully and over time, the names he knew, the ones he suspected. The approximate number of riders Reed kept on the payroll for this kind of work. He told her about the structure of the arrangement, how Reed stayed officially clean, kept his hands off the direct action, used intermediaries whose connection to him could be argued away in court. He told her about the timeline he believed Reed was operating on and what the signs would be when the deadline passed and the pressure became something more physical than a letter. She listened the way she always listened, completely, sorting the information as it arrived, noting the parts that mattered most and setting them into order. When he finished, she said, "The trail into camp. You said one road in and one out. Is there any secondary access? Forest Service, logging access, anything?" "There's an old logging spur about a mile west," he said. "Barely passable. We use it occasionally for secondary supply runs when the main trail floods. Reed's men won't know it," she said. "They might not," he said. "They won't," she said. "Men like Reed's men study the official records. The spur won't be on any county map because it predates the formal survey." He looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize as his version of being impressed, a slight widening of the eyes, a fractional softening of the line of his mouth, almost imperceptible unless you had been studying his face for 8 weeks. "How do you know that?" "Because Mrs. Calloway's husband laid 3 miles of private logging track in the hills above Crestfall 20 years ago and it doesn't appear on any county document, and when I asked him why, he explained the survey process to me in significant detail because no one ever thought to ask him about it before." She paused. "People will tell you a great deal if you ask them questions no one else has thought to ask." "I'm aware of that," Hawk said. "You've been demonstrating it since the day you arrived." She did not respond to that. She had learned that compliments from Hawk were not performances, they were observations delivered with the same directness as any other observation, and the appropriate response to an observation was acknowledgement. Not deflection. But she was not yet entirely comfortable with acknowledgement, and so she sometimes chose the third option, which was to let it land and then move on without comment. "Mark the spur on a camp map," she said. "And don't tell anyone you've done it," he nodded. He was about to leave, and then he didn't, and she knew without turning that he was still in the doorway because the quality of the air in the room had not changed in the way it changed when he left. "Ida May," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with his full attention, all of it, undivided, the way he paid attention to things that mattered to him most. "I need you to know," he said, "that whatever happens with Reed, whatever this becomes, I will not let it reach you." She held his gaze. The declaration sat in the air between them, warm and serious and carrying with it the weight of a man who does not make statements he doesn't intend to honor. "I know that," she said. "And I need you to know the same thing." In the other direction, something crossed his face, surprise, perhaps, or the cousin of surprise, and then it resolved into something quieter and more profound, the expression of a man who has been told, for the first time in his memory, that someone has placed themselves between him and harm and meant it. He left. The wash house settled around her. Outside, the camp went about its business. Axes, the sawmill, men's voices, the ordinary productive noise of the forest operation, but underneath all of it, Ida May felt the change in the air. The same way the creek ran differently before a heavy rain, before the snowmelt came down from the mountains and changed the volume and speed of everything, a subtle shift in pressure, a deepening of current, a sense of something building in the distance that had not yet declared its full intention. She thought about the letter in Hawk's coat pocket. She thought about Clement Reed in his county office with his official records and his unofficial arrangements, moving his pieces across a board he believed he controlled entirely. She thought about the 30-day deadline and what it meant and what lay on the other side of it. She picked up the next shirt from the pile. She went back to work. In the days that followed, the camp's ordinary rhythm continued on the surface while something else moved beneath it. Hawk sent letters east, to the lawyer in Portland, to the federal land office, to two men whose names he did not share with her but whose existence he acknowledged. Callum began conducting quiet evening headcounts of men who could be counted on in a difficult situation, speaking to each individually, framing it as standard precaution for a remote operation. Extra supply runs brought in things that were not listed on the public inventory, things stored in a locked section of the supply barn that Ida May noted without commenting on. The men of the camp felt it too. This was not a group of men who were easily frightened. They worked every day in conditions that had genuine lethal potential, underground and in the trees, with machinery and weather and the simple brutal physics of heavy timber and rock. But there was a difference between the danger that was ordinary and the danger that was intentional, and men who had been in the territory long enough could feel that difference the way old bones feel weather. She noticed it in the laundry. The clothing told its story, as it always did. Men who are anxious move differently than men who are at ease, and different movement produces different wear patterns, different tensions in fabric, different angles of accumulated grime. She noticed it and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to be said, and because the most important contribution she could make to the camp's readiness was the one she was already making, keeping every man in clean, functional, intact workwear, because men who are physically comfortable and unencumbered by ill-fitting or damaged clothing make better decisions under pressure than men who are not. It was a small thing. It was also the only thing. She made it count. On the 19th day after the letter arrived, 3 riders came down the main trail. They came in mid-morning, which was the most dangerous time. Hawk was at the mine head, Callum was in the tree line with the senior loggers. And the camp center was staffed primarily by the younger workers and the cook. Ida May saw them from the wash house window and recognized the quality of their arrival before she recognized the men themselves, the particular affected casualness of people who are trying to appear like they are simply passing through while leaving nothing to chance. There were 3 of them. They rode good horses. They wore no official insignia. Their guns were visible, holstered but unsnapped, and the one in the lead, a broad man with a flat, affectless face, scanned the camp clearing with the methodical attentiveness of someone who is counting exits and occupants simultaneously. They pulled up in the center of the clearing. Dale, who had been checking one of the wagon wheels, straightened and said nothing, which was very much his style. "Looking for Mercer," the lead man said. His voice was flat, like his face, not threatening in register, which made it more threatening in effect. "Not here," Dale said. "When's he back?" "Don't know." The lead man looked around the clearing with that slow, counting attention. His gaze passed over the wash house window, and Ida May pulled herself sideways, out of the line of sight, without making a sound. Through the narrow remaining angle of glass, she watched the man's gaze move on, past her, past the supply barn, past the cook shack, and settle on the outbuildings at the far end of the clearing with the particular interest of someone identifying what is valuable and what is vulnerable. "Tell him Reed says the conversation should happen soon," the lead man said. "Waiting has a cost." Dale said nothing. He turned back to the wagon wheel. The three men exchanged a look that was too practiced to mean nothing, and then turned their horses and rode back down the main trail at a pace that was deliberately unhurried, saying, "We are not afraid of you, and we will be back when we choose." Ida May was at the camp center before the sound of their horses had fully faded, moving with a speed and directness that made the young miner nearest her take a reflexive step backward. "Get word to Callum," she said. "Now. And somebody needs to ride to the mine head." The young miner stared at her. "Now," she said, and there was something in her voice, not a shout, not a threat, but a quality of absolute conviction that occupied the same register as both, that moved him into action before he had consciously decided to move. She went to find the camp map that Hawk had marked. By the time Hawk arrived back from the mine head, white-lipped with a controlled fury that expressed itself in the extreme quietness of his movements, Callum had already organized the men into their working positions, ordinary tasks, the camp performing its usual function with the slightly heightened alertness of a creature that has been reminded that it exists in a predator's territory. Hawk and Ida May stood in the supply barn with Callum and the two senior men, and Hawk's jaw was doing the thing it did, and his eyes had gone the full Winter Creek gray that they went when he was at the far edge of what he could hold without acting. They were counting exits, Ida May said. And looking at the supply barn specifically. If they come in force, they'll want the supplies and the equipment first. That's how you cripple an operation before you take it. You strip its capacity to function. You read all that from watching them for 2 minutes through a window, one of the senior loggers said, not unkindly, but with the skepticism of a man being asked to credit intelligence that arrived from an unexpected direction. "I read it from 31 years of watching men decide what they want and how to take it," Ida May said evenly. "The supply barn is the priority target. Whatever you're storing in the locked section needs to either be moved or secured against forced entry. Ideally both." The senior logger looked at Hawk. Hawk looked at Ida May with the gray-green eyes that were, at this particular moment, completely steady, not cold, not warm, simply present and trusting in a way that she felt the full weight of. "She's right," Hawk said. They worked through the afternoon on preparations that looked, from the outside, like ordinary camp maintenance. The locked section of the supply barn was quietly reorganized. The secondary logging spur to the west was cleared enough to be passable at speed, and a man who knew the terrain was stationed at its beginning with a fast horse and instructions. Callum walked the perimeter of the camp and identified the 3 positions that provided the best sight lines down the main trail, and 3 men who could be trusted rotated through those positions under the cover of routine work. Ida May moved through all of this doing exactly what she always did, washing, wringing, hanging, returning. And as she moved she watched, and as she watched she catalogued. And the catalog she was building was not about laundry at all. That evening, when the camp had settled into its supper routine, she found Hawk at the edge of the clearing where the tree line began, standing in the last light that came through the canopy's edge at that angle, a thin, golden-green light that caught the side of his face and made him look for a moment like something ancient and self-contained. A man made of the same material as the mountain he'd carved his mind from. She stood beside him. They looked at the tree line together. 11 days to the deadline, she said. "Yes," he said. "The lawyer from Portland, 3 days out. The land office, no response yet." His jaw set. Government timelines don't account for 30-day ultimatums from county assessors with criminal arrangements. She nodded. The forest was full of its evening sounds, the creek, the birds, the massive quiet of the trees themselves, that particular presence the Douglas firs had at dusk, as though the darkness that came was coming from inside them outward rather than from the sky down. "We should talk," Hawk said, "about what happens if the deadline passes before the legal process catches up." "I know," she said. "I'm not going to pretend there's no possibility of physical confrontation," he said. "Reed's men are not men who stop at letters. I know that too." He turned to look at her. The golden-green light was fading now, the forest dimming around them by degrees, and in the diminishing light his expression was more open than she had seen it in the daylight, the night having the same effect on him that it had on many self-contained people. Dissolving some of the maintenance required to stay composed in the full light of observation. "I should not have brought you here," he said. It cost him something to say it. She could see that. "I should have, when the letter came, I should have given you the option to go somewhere the situation couldn't reach you. You gave me the information," she said. "That's the same thing." "I chose, I know you chose," he said. "And I know you'd make the same choice again, and I know that I have no reasonable argument against your right to make it." He paused. "None of that changes the fact that if something happens to you because of this situation, it will be," he stopped. Started again. "It will be something I carry." She was quiet for a moment. The last of the golden light went out of the canopy and the forest went fully to its evening gray, and they stood in it, very close together, not quite touching. "Hawk," she said. "Look at me." He looked at her. She held his gaze with hers, steadily, the way she had learned to hold things that needed to be held, with the full, committed weight of both hands, and no flinching. "I have been negotiating difficult terrain alone since I was 16 years old," she said. "Every step of it. Every bad employer and narrow room and market day crowd and public humiliation, alone. And I managed. I endured it, and I came through it. And I built something from it even though no one was looking." She paused. "This is the first time in my life that there is someone beside me in difficult terrain. And you are asking me to step back because the terrain is difficult." She shook her head, very slightly. "That is the one thing I will not do." He looked at her for a long time. Around them, the forest held its breath, the creek, the birds, everything reduced for a moment to silence, as though the world had leaned in to listen. Then Hawk Mercer, who had spent 22 years building an empire in the Oregon Territory with his hands and his will and his absolute refusal to depend on anyone, lifted one hand and placed it, with extraordinary care, against the side of her face. She felt the roughness of his palm, the calluses, the cold of the outdoor evening on his skin, and underneath the roughness, the deliberate, reverent gentleness of the touch, the way a man handles a thing he considers precious and irreplaceable and has perhaps only recently understood the full depth of his feeling for. "Then we face it," he said. "Together, together," she said. The words sat between them in the Oregon dark like an oath. Like the first stone laid in the foundation of something that intended to stand for a very long time. And from somewhere to the east, faint, distant, barely audible over the sound of the creek and the trees, came the first low rumble of something that was not thunder. Not quite, moving across the territory toward them through the night air like a warning delivered in the wrong language, the kind that doesn't fully translate until it arrives. That distant rumble came from the east, and it came back the following morning, and the morning after that, each time slightly closer, slightly less ambiguous, until on the fourth day after the three riders had stood in the clearing counting exits, the sky to the east turned a color that none of the men in camp had a precise word for, not brown, not red, not the orange of wildfire smoke, but something between all three, a bruised and murky hue that sat on the horizon like a stain spreading through cloth. Mick, the oldest of the loggers, stood in the clearing at dawn with his coffee going cold in his hand and looked at it for a long time without speaking. He had worked the Oregon Territory for 30 years, had come up from the high desert country east of the Cascades, had seen weather that most men in the valley never encountered because most men in the valley didn't go east of the mountains by choice. "What is that?" the young miner who had fetched Callum for Ida May asked him. Mick drank his cold coffee. Dust, he said. What kind of dust? The wrong kind, Mick said. Moving fast and coming this way, he was right on both counts. By noon that day, the eastern sky had deepened from its bruised hue to something actively threatening, a wall of particulate matter the color of old blood. Moving across the high desert on winds that had no business being this far west, driven by some convergence of conditions that the territory's weather had never before produced in living memory. The wall was immense. Even at distance, even through 30 miles of intervening valley, it was possible to see its scale, the way it rose from the ground to the upper atmosphere without interruption, a solid curtain of suspended earth that blocked the horizon completely. Callum and Hawk stood at the east edge of the clearing and looked at it, and the calculation happening behind Hawk's eyes was the most visible Ida may have ever seen it. He was adding columns, the kind of columns that had no clean answer. 7 days remained to Reed's deadline. The lawyer from Portland had arrived 2 days ago and was installed in the camp's small office cabin, working through the land records with the focused intensity of a man who was finding exactly what he'd been told he would find and who understood the timeline he was working against. The Federal Land Office had sent a preliminary acknowledgement, not an investigation, not yet, but the first evidence that the paperwork had arrived and been read. 7 days might be enough. 7 days, with a storm coming in from the east that looked like it intended to erase the world, was a different calculation entirely. It'll hit by tomorrow, Mick said. From behind them. He had not been invited into the conversation, but he was 60 years old and he had knowledge that was not available to anyone else, and so no one told him to go away. Maybe sooner if the wind picks up overnight. When it hits, you won't see your hand in front of your face. Won't be able to breathe outside without something over your mouth and nose. Last time I saw one like this, it lasted 6 hours, last time, Hawk said. Where? Harney County, Mick said. 82. The dust came off the lake bed. Red, like that. Took 3 days to get the grit out of everything afterward. Hawk looked at the wall of incoming weather and then at Callum, and something passed between them. The shorthand of 9 years working together. A full conversation compressed into 2 seconds of eye contact. Get everything that can be damaged inside, Hawk said. Equipment, supplies, anything that can't get wet or buried. Start now. Callum was already moving. Ida May watched the sky for another moment and then went back to the wash house and looked at her lines of drying laundry. 2 days' worth, everything she had processed since Monday, all of it hanging in various stages of dryness across the full length of the interior racks and the exterior lines she had strung between the outbuildings. She made a rapid calculation. The exterior work would be destroyed by dust, made worse than unwashed, contaminated with the kind of fine particulate that worked itself into fiber in a way that ordinary washing couldn't fully clear. She began taking it all down. It was while she was working on the exterior lines, her arms full of barely dry canvas trousers, that she saw the second problem arriving from the west. They came out of the tree line at the western edge of the clearing, not from the main trail, which was east, but from the secondary logging spur that Hawk had identified and that she had assumed was unknown to Reed's operation. There were more of them than the 3 who had visited before. She counted 7 before the rest of the laundry blocked her view, and then she stepped sideways and counted 4 more behind the first 7, 11 men, riding out of the supposedly unknown secondary access point. Into the camp clearing from the direction opposite the approaching storm, the flat-faced lead rider from before was among them. He had brought company. Ida May dropped the laundry. She was already moving toward the camp center before the first rider had fully cleared the tree line, moving with the speed she was capable of when the social performance of unhurriedness was no longer the relevant priority, and she was fast, genuinely fast, in a way that surprised people who had categorized her body as slow before they had seen it in actual motion. She crossed the clearing to where Dale was working on the supply barn door and said, "Riders from the west spur. 11 at least. Get Callum." And then she turned and went toward the office cabin without waiting to see if Dale moved because she already knew he would. The lawyer from Portland, a dry, precise man named Aldrich who wore his suit like armor and his spectacles like a weapon, looked up from his papers when she came through the door. Miss Strom, is Hawk here? He left 10 minutes ago. I believe he went to. She was already out the door. She found Hawk at the supply barn, where Callum had just reached him, both of them turning toward the western tree line as the first riders broke into the full open of the clearing. Hawk's expression did the thing it did when he had reached the end of calculation and arrived at action. It went very still. Very focused, the fine-grained control of a man who has decided that the time for preparation is over. Count, he said, to her, 11 that I saw. Possibly more in the trees. She glanced at the eastern sky. The wall of dust was closer now, significantly closer than it had been 20 minutes ago. The wind had picked up. She could feel it on her face, dry and wrong, carrying a faint smell of things from far away, minerals and emptiness. The storm is accelerating, I see it, he said. The flat-faced rider pulled up his horse at the clearing center, with his 10 companions fanning out to either side in the particular formation of men who have done this before and know their positions without being told. Behind them, at the forest's edge, there were indeed more riders. Ida May could see the shapes of horses in the trees, held in position, waiting. A reserve, the full complement, she estimated, was closer to 18, Mercer, the flat-faced rider said. His voice carried across the clearing with the ease of a man who has learned that volume is less intimidating than certainty. Reed says the conversation is overdue. Hawk walked to the clearing center with Callum at his shoulder and 6 of his senior men fanning out behind him, a mirror of the other side's formation, deliberate and unhurried, the choreography of men who are not going to be the ones who flinch first. The conversation is in progress. Hawk said. Through the appropriate legal channels. Your employer will receive the relevant documentation within the week. The flat-faced rider looked at him with the specific expression of a man who has heard references to legal process many times in his professional career and has never once found them to be an obstacle that a sufficient number of riders couldn't resolve. Reed doesn't wait for documentation, the rider said. What Reed waits for is a number. You know the number. Give it, and we leave. Don't give it, and we stay until the business is concluded. He meant it literally. Ida May, watching from the wash-house doorway, understood that the business he was referring to concluded with Hawk either broken or gone. The operation ceased, the camp stripped to its assets. The 11 visible riders and the reserve in the trees were not a negotiating position. They were a sentence being delivered, and then the wind hit, not the storm itself, not yet, but its leading edge, the gust that preceded the wall by some minutes, carrying the first payload of fine red dust in a sudden horizontal blast that swept across the clearing like a slap. Men turned their faces away, horses shied and stamped, and in the space of 30 seconds the quality of the light changed, the sun going strange, filtered through the first thin veil of particulate, turning the whole clearing a dim, apocalyptic amber. Storm's here. Mick said, from somewhere behind her. His voice was even. He had known it was coming, it was not here yet. But in the eastern sky, visible even from the clearing, the wall had resolved from distant threat to imminent fact, a solid red curtain 70 meters high, blotting the horizon from north to south as far as she could see, moving across the valley floor at a speed that would bring it to the forest's edge in minutes, not hours. The miscalculation of its timeline was nobody's fault. Dust storms do not consult schedules. The flat-faced rider looked east and looked back at Hawk and made his calculation, which was visible on his face as it happened. The storm would buy the camp several hours of cover. Would make any organized response impossible, would create the kind of chaos in which a lot could be accomplished and very little could be afterward proven. He reached his conclusion. Ida May saw him reach it. She saw his hand move toward the 6 men at his immediate left and saw the gesture he made, economical and practiced, and she knew what the gesture meant because she had spent 31 years reading the physical language of men who had already decided. Hawk, she called, and her voice had the cutting clarity of a woman who has never once in her life needed to be told twice to speak up. They're moving, everything happened at once, the way it always does in moments that take years to fully understand. Time compressing into a sequence of images rather than a narrative. The cause and effect collapsing into simultaneity. The 6 riders on the left broke from their positions, moving not toward Hawk and his men but flanking wide, toward the supply barn, confirming everything Ida May had said about their first priority. Callum saw it and sent 3 men to intercept. The flat-faced rider drove his horse forward at Hawk, who did not move, who stood exactly where he was in the center of the clearing while the horse came on, and at the last second stepped sideways with a speed that no one watching would have predicted from looking at him, and caught the rider's arm as he passed, using the horse's own momentum to pull the man from the saddle, and the rider hit the dirt of the clearing with a sound that carried even over the wind. The storm hit the tree line. It came through the forest like something alive and angry, not gently, not gradually, but all at once, a wall of sound and pressure and airborne earth that struck the camp clearing like a physical blow. The light went from amber to a deep, choking red-brown. Visibility dropped to 5 feet, then 3, then less. The sound was enormous, a sustained roar that was not like wind in the ordinary sense but like a landscape in motion, the whole high desert east of the Cascades vibrating at a frequency that the chest felt before the ears registered it. Men shouted and were heard by no one. Horses screamed. The careful formations of both sides dissolved instantly into individual figures lurching through the red dark. Unable to see their allies or their enemies, unable to breathe without covering their mouths, unable to orient by sight because there was nothing to see in any direction except the dense, suffocating red, Ida May had gone back into the wash house when the wall hit the tree line. Not to hide, there was no hiding from a dust storm, the building's thin walls immediately beginning to admit red particulate through every gap and joint, but to think. She tied her apron across the lower half of her face, pulling the fabric tight enough to filter. She pulled her bonnet down low. She put on the heavy work gloves she kept on the table for handling lye. And then she stood in the red dim interior of the wash house and listened to the camp disintegrate outside. And she figured out where Hawk was. He had been at the clearing center when the wall hit. The supply barn was to the east, southeast, she corrected herself, accounting for the clearing's slight angle. The main structural supports of the camp, the load-bearing ones that held the cook shack roof over its east extension and braced the supply barn's attached storage lean-to, ran along a north-south axis. In a wind coming from due east at this velocity, the weakest point would be, she moved to the door, opened it against the wind with her shoulder, and stepped out. The red was total. She kept one hand on the wash house wall and moved along it to its corner, orienting by touch. The wind was a sustained physical pressure against her body, not gusting, not variable, a constant horizontal force that pushed against her solid weight and found it insufficient to move her, or found it slower to move than it would have found a lighter person, which in this moment was the only relevant distinction. She moved into the clearing by the route she had memorized in 11 weeks of walking it in the dark. 20 steps from the wash house corner to the woodpile, 45 degrees. Right, 12 steps to the supply barn's west wall. She counted steps. The red dust made it impossible to breathe directly. She breathed through the apron fabric, short and shallow, her eyes mostly closed. Navigating by the map inside her skull rather than by anything available to her senses outside it, she almost walked into him. He was on the ground at the supply barn's southeast corner, not unconscious but compromised. She could see, when she crouched beside him, that something had caught him across the left temple, a grazing blow from something she couldn't identify in the red dark. And the combination of the impact and the disorienting totality of the storm had him moving in the slow, deliberate way of someone whose body has temporarily separated from its full command structure. He had his coat pulled up over the lower half of his face and his eyes were shut against the dust. Hawk. She put her hand on his face, the way he had touched hers, with full attention, with the full communication of presence. Hawk, it's me. His eyes opened. Even in the red dim dark, with the storm roaring around them, she could see the moment of recognition, the slight relaxation of the lines around his eyes, the specific settling of something that had been braced. Ida May. His voice was rough with dust. The men are managing, she said, without knowing if this was fully true. Are you hurt? Something hit me. He pushed to sitting, and she put her arm under his and helped him up with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone accustomed to moving weight. He was taller than her and lean, but she had been managing heavy loads in difficult conditions for 15 years and she braced without strain. "I'm standing. I'm all right." He wasn't entirely all right. She could feel the lack of full steadiness in the arm she was supporting, could feel the way his balance was recalibrating, but he was upright and conscious and moving, which in the current situation was sufficient. Then the sound changed. It was the supply barn storage lean-to. She heard it before she saw it, the deep groan of stressed timber that precedes catastrophic structural failure, the language of wood at the end of its capacity. The east wall of the lean-to had taken the full force of the storm wind and the fastening on the roof's main support beam had been, she didn't know if it had been deliberately compromised or simply overwhelmed. And it didn't matter, had been insufficient, and the beam was going, it was going toward them. She had perhaps 2 seconds of understanding before it happened. 2 seconds is a long time if your body already knows what to do. Hers did. She pivoted, putting herself between Hawk and the lean-to wall, and she got her hands up and against the falling beam at the moment it came down, not catching it, exactly, nothing catches a full timber support beam, but redirecting its fall, her hands finding the underside of it and her arms driving up and outward, her whole body engaging from the floor up, the strength in her legs and her core and her arms and her back all coming into it simultaneously. The full accumulated physical consequence of 15 years of the hardest manual labor available to a woman in the Oregon Territory. The beam groaned against her hands. The weight of it was enormous and she felt it from her palms to the soles of her feet, felt the tendons in her wrists and the deep muscles along her spine light up with the specific, clarifying pain of maximum effort. She did not let it down. She could not hold it indefinitely. No one could hold a falling structural beam indefinitely. But she did not need to hold it indefinitely. She needed to hold it for long enough. "Move," she said to Hawk, through her teeth, through the apron fabric, through the roaring red dark. He moved. She felt him clear the space to her left, 3 steps, out from under the beam's arc of fall, and then she let the beam down in a controlled way, angling it away from them both, her arms giving in stages rather than all at once, her body absorbing the descent rather than dropping it, until the beam settled into the dirt of the clearing at an angle that would have fallen on empty space if it had fallen 2 minutes earlier. She straightened. Every large muscle in her back and arms and legs informed her, in detail, of what she had just done to them. She stood in the red roaring dark and breathed through the apron and let the pain make its catalogue of itself, and then she set it aside. Because the storm was still happening and the men of the camp were still in it and there was still work to do, Hawk was beside her. She felt his hand find her arm in the red dark, not directing her, not steadying her, simply placing itself against her as evidence of his presence, the same gesture she had made to him on the ground. "You held it," he said. His voice, through the dust and the storm, was something she had never heard it be before. "Temporarily," she said. "Ida May, are there men still between the supply barn and the bunkhouse?" she said. "Because that's where Reed's riders will have pushed in the storm. They came from the west, so the wind's at their backs. They can move through it faster. Callum's men are fighting into the wind." A pause, brief, the pause of a man recalibrating. "Then, yes," he said. "You're right, then we move," she said. They moved. What followed was not a battle in any organized sense, organization being the first casualty of a dust storm that has reduced visibility to 0 and hearing to a radius of 4 feet. It was a series of individual encounters in the red dark, men finding each other by sound and proximity, alliances maintained by memory of whose side you were on rather than by any ability to see who you were facing. Ida May moved through it with Hawk at her back and a clarity of navigational certainty that came from having memorized the camp's geometry over 11 weeks of moving through it in the pre-dawn dark. In the rain, in the ordinary blindness of the overcast Oregon night, she knew where the woodpile was. She knew where the gap between the cook shack and the bunkhouse narrowed to a passage that one person could move through quickly and 2 could not. She knew where the ground dipped, where the old stump created an obstacle at ankle height, where the 3 supporting posts of the main drying line ran in a row that would catch a moving horse across the chest if it came from the wrong direction. She used all of it. Not as a weapon, exactly. She was not a person who had ever trained in the combat applications of situational knowledge, but as a guide. She moved through the camp's blind landscape and she called out to Callum's men when she could identify them. Orienting them by her voice the way a lighthouse orients ships by light, giving them the geography they couldn't see. At the woodpile, she and Hawk found 2 of Reed's riders who had lost their horses in the storm and were moving blind, and Hawk handled that with the same unhurried physical economy she had observed in the clearing, fast and decisive and without theatrics. And Ida May did not look away because she was not naive about what it meant to protect something you had built, and she did not pretend otherwise. She found Orrin, the large miner with the dinner plate hands, standing with his back against the supply barn wall, with one of Reed's men on the ground in front of him and a confused expression behind his dust-coated face. "Which way is the bunkhouse?" he shouted at her. "Over the storm," she pointed. He went. She found Callum at the north end of the clearing, where the storm had pushed a cluster of Reed's reserve riders who had come in from the tree line and promptly lost all tactical coherence when the dust hit. Callum had 3 of his men with him and the situation was, by the time she arrived, already resolved. The reserve riders were disoriented and separated from their horses, and the particular advantage of numbers that Reed's plan had depended on had been entirely dissolved by the storm's democracy of blindness. It turned out that 18 men in a dust storm had no advantage over 8 men in a dust storm if the 8 men knew the terrain and the 18 did not. The storm lasted 4 hours. When it ended, not gradually, but with the abruptness that Mick had predicted, the wall moving on westward and leaving behind it a world coated in red-brown silt, every surface, every object, every upturned face the same color as the dust that had produced it, the camp clearing was a tableau of exhaustion. Reed's men were down to 11, for had departed, or been departed, through mechanisms the storm had obscured from the official record. The 11 who remained were collected, dusty, disarmed, and possessed of the specific deflation of men whose plan has been defeated by a combination of human competence and geological misfortune. The flat-faced lead rider sat on the ground near the center of the clearing with his wrists tied and dust in his hair and an expression that had lost all of its practiced certainty. Hawk stood in the center of the clearing and looked at the collected remnants of Reed's force and looked at his own men, dusty, marked by the afternoon's work, but standing, all of them standing. And then he looked at Ida May. She was standing at the edge of the clearing near the supply barn, her apron still across her face where she had pulled it down to her chin, her gloves gray with dust, the broad set of her shoulders carrying the particular quality of a body that has given a great deal and is still, quietly, refusing to be finished. There was dust in the lines of her face, dust in the folds of her clothes, dust in the cracked knuckles of her hands. She looked like the landscape itself, like she had been made of the same material as the storm. Or had simply stood through it long enough to become indistinguishable from the world's capacity to endure. He crossed the clearing to her. He did not look at anyone else as he walked. The men who observed this, and several did, registered it without comment, with the collective discretion of people who have watched something build over 11 weeks and find they are not surprised at all by its destination. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, her hands, the lean-to beam lying at its odd angle in the dirt 30 feet away. "You held a structural beam," he said. "I redirected it," she said. "There's a difference, Ida May." "I'm all right," she said. "My back will make a point of disagreeing with that for approximately the next week. But I'm all right." His hand came up and he touched her face again, the same way he had on the trail's edge in the forest dark, with the same extraordinary care, but this time in full daylight, in the center of the camp clearing, with 30-odd dusty and battered witnesses standing in every direction. He did not seem to be aware of the witnesses, or, more accurately, he seemed to have decided they were not relevant information. She did not pull away. "You pulled me back from something," he said. His voice was quiet, addressed to her only. "And then you walked back into it. You would have done the same," she said. "I know," he said. "That's exactly how I know what it cost." She looked at him, really looked at him. in the strange washed light that came through the settling dust, in the aftermath of the storm and the violence and the long arc of all the weeks that had preceded this moment. She looked at this man who had set her name on a Crestfall boardwalk like it was a thing of value, who had built an empire with his hands in an Oregon forest, who had laughed once, abruptly, in a wash house, as though it surprised him, and who was looking at her now with everything behind his gray-green eyes fully visible, nothing maintained or managed, the full truth of what he was and what he felt offered up in the plain afternoon light with no condition attached. Her hands, dusty, cracked, calloused, built by every load she had ever carried, came up and found the front of his coat. "We still have work to do," she said, very quietly. "Yes," he said, "but first." She looked at him. "First, I need you to know, all of this. All of it. It was worth it." His forehead came down to rest against hers. In the center of the dust-coated clearing, with Callum and Orrin and Dale and Mick and 30-odd other witnesses in every direction, Hawk Mercer closed his eyes and breathed, and the breath that came out of him was the breath of a man setting down something very heavy that he has been carrying for a very long time. Around them, very carefully, the camp began to look away. The dust took 3 days to fully settle, not the storm itself. That had moved on westward within its 4 hours, as Mick had predicted, leaving behind it a sky that was clear and hard and blue in the way that skies sometimes go after a violence, as though the atmosphere itself was trying to demonstrate that it bore no responsibility for what had just passed through it. But the dust it had deposited across every surface of the camp, every board, every beam, every piece of equipment, every inch of hanging laundry, every face and hand of every man who had stood in it, took 3 days to address, and in those 3 days Ida May worked with a thoroughness that suggested she was not simply cleaning but restoring something to itself, returning the camp to a version of itself that the storm had temporarily obscured but had not, ultimately, managed to unmake. She started with the wash house itself, because the wash house was her domain and because the dust had infiltrated it completely, coating the scrub brushes and the soap tins and the work table and the drying racks in a fine red-brown layer that had also settled into every piece of laundry she had been in the process of washing when the storm hit. She swept, then wiped, then swept again. She resorted the laundry into what could be salvaged and what could not. She opened both windows and the door and let the post-storm air move through, and the post-storm air was cold and clean and smelled of pine and creek water and the particular mineral clarity that always followed weather, and she breathed it in with the appreciation of someone who had spent 4 hours breathing red dust through an apron. Her back did make its point, as she had predicted. The muscles along her spine and across her shoulders and down into her lower back delivered a sustained commentary on the afternoon of the storm that was specific and informative. She could identify from the pattern of the soreness, exactly which moment of the beam redirection had cost what, the way a mechanic can read a worn part and understand the history of the load it has carried. She did not stop working. She adjusted her method slightly, using her legs more and her back less, and she kept the stove in the wash house burning hot through the first night because the warmth helped, and she kept moving because stillness was worse. Hawk came to the wash house on the first morning after the storm and stood in the doorway and looked at her working and said, "You should rest." She wrung out a canvas shirt with both hands, using the motion that put the least demand on the compromised muscles. "So should you," she said. "You were hit in the head. Aldrich says the case against Reed is strong enough to proceed," he said. "The land assessments, 3 of them in the past 18 months, are demonstrably fraudulent. He found a 4th last night. And the riders from the camp are being held by 2 of my men until the county sheriff arrives, and the county sheriff is a man who has his own reasons to dislike Reed's operation." He paused. "It's moving, good," she said. "I wanted you to know," he said. "Because you are part of why it's moving. If you hadn't identified the secondary spur on the map, if we hadn't had those preparations in place before the storm helped." She said, "The storm was chaos," he said. "Chaos only helps if you're prepared for it." "You prepared for it." She looked at him across the work table. He was standing in the wash house doorway in the early morning light, and the bruise at his left temple had gone the colors of a dark autumn sunset, and he was still the most self-contained man she had ever encountered, and she realized with the plain matter-of-fact clarity that she brought to all assessments, somewhere along the course of the past 11 weeks fallen for him in a way that was not recoverable and that she found she had no interest in recovering from. "Hawk," she said. "Yes, stop standing in the doorway," she said. "Either come in or don't, but the draft is getting into the drying." He came in. He sat on the stool in the corner that had been placed there, she suspected, by Orrin or Dale or one of the other men who had observed the pattern of his visits and made the practical provision without comment. He sat on it and watched her work, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that had stopped being about anything other than two people being in the same space and finding that space improved by the other's presence. "I'm going to Portland next week," he said, eventually. "With Aldrich. The federal proceeding will be filed there." He paused. "I'd like you to come," she looked up from the washboard. "To Portland? You've never been, as far as I know." "I've never been," she said. "I've barely been anywhere." "I know," he said. "That seems like something that should change." He was looking at her with that full, unhurried attention, and the quality of what he was saying, the weight underneath the practical framing of it, was entirely clear to her because she had been reading the text of him for 11 weeks and she was fluent in it by now. She looked at him for a moment. "For the legal proceeding," she said, and her voice was not quite even, "and for other things," he said. "If you're willing." She picked up the next shirt from the pile. She held it for a moment without starting on it. "Ask what you're going to ask," she said, which was what she had said to him on the forest trail in the 6th week, the first time the conversation had become something beyond what they were both prepared to name. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was always quiet when he was choosing words with full intention rather than filling space with them. "I have spent 22 years building something," he said. "The mine, the logging operation, the territory, all of it. I built it because building it was the thing that made sense when I was 20 years old with $40 and wrong map and no one to answer to. I built it because the building of it was the closest I could get to a life that felt real. Mine. Something I made rather than something I was handed." He paused. "I don't know that I built it for anyone. I didn't think there was anyone to build it for." He looked at his hands, and then at her. "I was wrong about that." Ida May set the shirt down on the table. She turned to face him fully, with nothing between them. "Hawk," she said, "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not as the camp's laundress, though I note, for the record, that you have transformed the camp's laundry situation from a liability into a genuine operational asset, and I say that as a businessman." The corner of his mouth moved in that almost smile. "I'm asking you to stay as the person this is for. All of it. If you're willing to have it." The morning light came through the wash house windows and lay across the floor in long rectangles, and the creek ran outside, and the forest was doing its green dim breathing thing on all sides, and Ida May Strom stood in the middle of her wash house in her work dress with her calloused hands and her cracked knuckles and a 3 days post-storm soreness still making its catalog along her spine, and she looked at the man she had somehow, in the ordinary course of working and walking and talking in the deep Oregon forest, come to trust more completely than she had ever trusted anyone. She thought about the rope bed in the small cabin. She thought about the tin cup of coffee left on her work table by an unknown hand on her first day. She thought about Orrin's second drying rack, and Callum's shoulder, and the man on the stump with the sealed envelope, and the rider in the clearing saying her name from across the dust. She thought about 31 years of earning space in a world that kept rearranging itself to exclude her. She thought about the boardwalk in Crestfall and a man stepping out of a doorway and saying her name like it meant something. "I'm willing," she said. The legal proceedings against Clement Reed moved with a speed that surprised most observers and did not surprise Ida May at all, because she had read Aldrich correctly on first assessment. The dry, precise lawyer from Portland was the kind of man who moved slowly in ordinary circumstances and with terrifying efficiency in circumstances that had fully engaged his professional indignation. For fraudulent land assessments had fully engaged it. A fifth, discovered on the second day in Portland, had pushed it past indignation into something that looked, on a dry and precise man, very much like righteous fury. The Federal Land Office opened a formal investigation within 2 weeks of the filing. The county sheriff, who had, as Hawk had said, his own reasons to dislike Reed's operation, those reasons being specific and personal and involving a timber claim on his family's land that Reed had assessed into inviolability 4 years earlier, proved to be cooperative in a way that went beyond professional duty into the category of enthusiastic personal satisfaction. The flat-faced lead writer, whose name turned out to be Grutter and who had been in Reed's employment for 6 years, made a series of statements to federal investigators that began strategic and ended comprehensive, because Grutter was a practical man and practical men in his position understand that the first person to provide useful testimony receives a different outcome than the ones who don't. Reed was removed from his county office in the 4th week. He was formally charged in the 6th. The trial, when it came, was held in Portland and Ida May attended 2 days of it, sitting in the gallery with Hawk beside her, watching Aldrich dismantle Reed's carefully constructed official persona with the methodical patience of someone who has been given more than enough material and is in no hurry. Because thoroughness was always more satisfying than speed, on the second day, during a recess, a woman in the gallery who had been watching the proceedings introduced herself to Ida May as the wife of one of the Northern Valley operators who had been squeezed by Reed's protection arrangement. She was a small, angular woman with sharp eyes and the manner of someone who had been managing difficult situations for a long time. She looked at Ida May with the direct, assessing attention of someone who does not bother with social performance. "You're the woman from Mercer's camp," she said. The one who held the beam. Ida May regarded her. "News travels," she said. "My husband's camp foreman was there." The woman said. "He came back with the story." She paused. "He also came back with the information that the secondary spur access on the Mercer property was identified and mapped by you, which is the reason Reed's riders came in through it already expected, which is the reason they were contained rather than overwhelming." She paused again. "I wanted to say thank you. My husband's operation benefited from Reed's removal. We all did." Ida May considered this. She was not accustomed to being thanked, not the way this woman was thanking her, directly and without the condescension of someone expressing gratitude to a person they consider beneath them in a hierarchy they're maintaining out of habit. This was the thanks of one person to another. "You're welcome," she said. And meant it. Portland itself was another thing she had not been prepared for. Not its size. She had imagined a city, and it was a city, but its texture, the particular way it held more possibility per square foot than anything she had experienced in Crestfall or in the deep forest. She walked its streets with Hawk in the evenings after the court proceedings, and she looked at the women in the storefronts and the offices and the establishments along the main avenue, and she observed the range of them, their sizes and their dress and their manner, and she noticed, with the careful attention of someone conducting a long-running observation, that the women who moved through this city with the most confidence were not the ones who best conformed to the narrow specification that Doyle Pratt and his kind had attempted to enforce on the main street of Crestfall. They were the ones who had simply decided they were allowed to be there, and had acted accordingly, and had kept acting accordingly until the city accommodated them. She thought, "I have been doing that my entire life. I simply didn't know that was what I was doing." On their 3rd evening in Portland, Hawk took her to dinner at a restaurant that was better than any establishment she had eaten in before, not in a way that made her feel scrutinized or out of place, which she had half expected, but in a way that simply provided good food in a well-lit room and left the rest to the people in it. She ordered what she wanted and ate it without apology and drank the glass of wine that Hawk poured for her and found it excellent, and the evening was the most quietly luxurious experience of her adult life, and she held that fact in mind without performing any particular response to it. Hawk watched her across the table with his full, unhurried attention, and at some point during the meal he said, "You look different here." "Then in the wash house," she said. "Then in Crestfall," he said. "The last time I saw you in a town of any size, someone was telling you to take the back alley." He looked at her directly. "You belong in every room, Ida May. I want you to know that I see that. I want you to know that I'll keep seeing it." She looked at him for a long moment. The restaurant was warm and smelled of good food, and the lamp on the table was making his eyes the warmer version of gray-green, the one that was harder to look at directly because it asked something of her that she was still learning how to give in the full, uncomplicated way he was offering it. "I know you see it," she said. "That's not the smallest part of why I'm here." They were married in the forest, not in a church, not in a town hall, not in any building at all, because the forest was their place. The specific green dim cathedral of the Douglas firs where they had built the map together, and it seemed to both of them that the only appropriate location for the thing they were declaring was the place where they had first learned to be honest with each other. Callum stood as witness, which he did with his usual economy of expression, though Ida May thought she detected in the scarred terrain of his face, when Hawk said what he said and she said what she said, a quality of feeling that he would never have named but that was genuine and visible if you knew where to look. Oren made a cake, which no one had asked him to do but which turned out to be better than any cake that either of them had asked for would have been. Dale wore a clean shirt. Mick played the fiddle, badly, with tremendous sincerity, and the music went up through the canopy in thin, silver threads that the forest swallowed entirely, which seemed right. The operational changes came after, in the practical deliberate way that Ida May had come to associate with how Hawk approached everything that mattered to him. Not impulsively, not with performance, but with the sustained attention of someone who intends the result to last. The laundry operation remained hers. This was not a point of discussion because it was never in question. She had built it from chaos into something that functioned, and she understood every component of it. And the idea that she would step away from a thing she had built because she had acquired a different status in the hierarchy of the operation would have struck her as absurd. She expanded it, hired 2 women from the valley who needed work, trained them in her methods, established the cold water protocol and the soap differentiation and the stain assessment process as documented procedure, because she had learned from watching Hawk that the difference between a thing that works and a thing that continues to work after you is documentation. Beyond the laundry, she began to sit in on the operational discussions. Not as a presence that needed to be accommodated or explained, but as a participant. Because Hawk invited her participation with the same directness he applied to everything, and because the men of the camp had observed 11 months of her reading situations more accurately than most of them could, and because Callum, whose authority in the camp was second only to Hawk's and who was not a man who gave credence to things he didn't believe in, had begun, sometime around the 4th month, to direct specific operational questions to her before he brought them to the larger group. She had opinions about supply management that turned out to significantly reduce waste. She had observations about the mining operations rotation schedule, derived from the pattern of the men's clothing wear, that the mining supervisor initially dismissed and then, 2 months later, quietly implemented. She had ideas about the logging road system that she had formulated from 12 months of moving through the forest on foot, understanding its terrain in a way that was different from how the men understood it because they were always moving through it with an objective and she had often been moving through it for its own sake, paying the kind of attention you pay to something you love, the territory noticed. Not because she announced herself, she had never announced herself in her life and she didn't intend to begin, but because operations that run better are visible in their results. And the Mercer operations results in the 18 months following the Reed proceedings were the kind that made other operators in the valley pay attention to the details that might account for the difference. Some of them sent inquiries. Some of them sent their foreman to look. A few of them came themselves, and sat with Hawk in the office cabin, and found that the discussions they were having included, naturally and without explanation, the woman who appeared to have opinions about everything from supply chain logistics to geological survey methodology and who offered those opinions with the same plain directness that her husband offered his, and who listened to theirs with the same complete attention. One operator from the Southern Valley, a man named Fredrickson who had built his timber operation over 15 years and was shrewd enough to have survived Reed's arrangement without either paying or being destroyed, sat across the table from them both one afternoon and at the end of the meeting, as he was standing to leave, looked at Ida May with an expression she had seen develop over the course of the conversation from skeptical assessment to something that was more complicated and more honest, the secondary access identification, he said. I heard the story. You read the survey gap from first principles, from understanding how surveys were conducted in this territory before the county standardized the process. She said. The gap wasn't invisible. It just required a different frame of reference to see. Fredrickson nodded, slowly. I have a survey question, he said, about a land claim north of here. If you're willing to look at it, send the paperwork, she said. He sent it within the week, along with a note that addressed her by her name rather than by any formulation of Mrs. Mercer or qualifier that would have reduced her to a derivative of someone else's identity. She read the survey documentation over 2 evenings at the small table in the cabin, which was no longer the closet-sized quarters she had been given on the first day but the main cabin, the one with the larger stove and the 2 windows and the bookshelf that Hawk had built in the second month and stocked with a mixture of his technical manuals and novels she had never had access to in her life, and she wrote her assessment in full. In the plain direct prose that was her natural register, and sent it back. Fredrickson's land claim was filed successfully 4 months later. He sent a letter that said, in its entirety, the assessment was accurate. Thank you. He included a fee that was reasonable and that she accepted because she had earned it and because the instinct to decline remuneration for good work was one she was actively working to eliminate from her character. Other survey questions followed. Other operational consultations. Not because she sought them, she had always been more interested in the doing of things than in the acquisition of a reputation for having done them, but because the territory was a network. And networks conducted information along their connections, and the information that kept appearing in the network was that the woman at the Mercer camp saw things that other people missed, and that this capacity was available if you addressed her directly and treated the arrangement as what it was. The empire, Hawk had called it once. Build a substantial empire. It had seemed, when she first understood what he meant by it, like a word that belonged to other people's stories, to men in novels, to the kind of people who had started with more than $40 and a wrong map. But empires, she had come to understand, were not built by people who started with the right tools. They were built by people who kept building when the tools were wrong and the map was wrong and the trail ended in a wall of Douglas firs so dense the sun couldn't get through. And who found, in the forced proximity of that particular darkness, something that was worth building toward. She thought about this on an October morning 14 months after the dust storm, standing at the edge of the camp clearing where it opened to the east. The secondary logging spur had been properly graded and widened, and beyond the tree line the valley spread out in the particular autumn amber that the Oregon Territory produced in October, the alder gold and the vine maple red and the dark green of the firs holding their color against everything that was changing around them. The mining operation was visible 2 miles east, a thin column of smoke from the equipment fires. The distant sound of the stamp mill carrying across the valley on the still air. Hawk came and stood beside her. He had come from the office cabin with something in his hand, a letter, she could see, bearing the Federal Land Office seal, the final determination on the Reed assessments, he said. Every claim we filed has been upheld. The contested parcels revert to their original holders. He paused. The Northern Valley properties, the 2 that burned, their owners have a legal basis to rebuild. She took this in. The 2 that burned. Men who had refused Reed and had lost everything for it and who would now have a legal basis to try again. It was not a restoration of what they had lost, which could not be fully restored. But it was the ground on which something could be rebuilt, which was the next best thing and sometimes, if the people were the right kind, amounted to the same thing eventually. Good, she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, an easy gesture, familiar now in the way that all the gestures between them had become familiar without losing any of their intention, the way a well-worn thing is still the thing and not a diminished version of it. She leaned slightly into the weight of his arm, which was the posture she had arrived at over 14 months of learning what it meant to let someone be beside you without bracing for the cost of it. I keep thinking, she said, about that market day. So do I, he said. Not about Pratt, she said quickly. I've thought about Pratt exactly as much as he deserves, which is very little. She paused. I think about the moment before you stepped out. I was about to go around. I had already decided to take the alley, I know, he said. I could see it, and then I didn't, she said. And then everything after that was, all of this. She looked at the valley spread below them, at the smoke from the mining operation, at the camp clearing behind her with its organized outbuildings and its lines of drying laundry and its crew of men who had learned her methods and trusted her assessment. I think about how close it was, she said. How close I was to the alley, but you didn't take it, he said. You stepped out, she said. You were already slowing down, he said. Before I stepped out. He looked at the side of her face. You were already deciding not to go, she thought about this. About whether it was true, and whether it could be verified, and whether the question of which of them had changed the moment first was a question with a real answer or simply the kind of question that love generates in retrospect. Looking back at its own beginning and trying to find the exact point of inception the way a cartographer tries to find the exact source of a river that has been running so long its beginning is more mythology than geography. Maybe, she said, the alley was never where you belonged, he said. You knew that. She was quiet for a moment. The valley breathed its October breath below them, and the creek ran behind the camp, and from the wash house came the sound of her two employees, May and Dorothea, both of them excellent, both of them now fully conversant with the cold water method and the soap differentiation and the stain assessment protocol, moving through the morning's work in the rhythm she had established. I know it now, she said. And then, after a moment, I think I always did. I just didn't know what it would look like when I got there. Hawk pulled her slightly closer. She let him. The valley spread out below them in the October morning, enormous and amber and indifferent to human scale in the way that only very large landscapes can be, and in that indifference was a kind of comfort, the comfort of a world that does not care whether you take the alley or don't, whether you shrink or don't, whether you fold yourself into the space allotted by other people's meanness or refuse it. The world does not care. The caring comes from inside. It always came from inside. She had carried it with her all the way from the Crestfall boardwalk. She was carrying it still. Only now it was not the solitary, exhausting work of a woman keeping herself alive through sheer refusal to be erased. Now it was something shared, its weight distributed, its warmth reflected and returned, she thought, 31 years. She thought, this is what all of it was moving toward, she thought, I could stay here, and then she thought, for the first time in her life without qualification, without the conditional tense, without the cautious distance of someone who has learned not to want things too completely, I am staying. She looked at the valley below them, at the empire they were building from the materials that life had actually provided, which were different from the ones either of them would have chosen if they had been designing from scratch, and which had turned out, as such materials sometimes do, to be sufficient. More than sufficient. The right materials, it turned out, for the thing they were making. The October light held for another hour and then began its slow descent, the shadows of the Douglas firs lengthening across the valley floor below, and Hawk and Ida May stood at the edge of the clearing and watched it happen, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that the valley wasn't already saying in the plain, unhurried language of a landscape that had been here long before them and intended to be here long after, patient and enormous and, in its own way, entirely on their side.